Well, welcome everyone to this AI ethics seminar at Chalmers AI Research Center. And a special welcome to today's speaker, who is Jakob Stenseke from Lund, who will speak about his somewhat paradoxical sounding first rule of the AI control problem, but I expect everything will become clear. Jakob, this is
Yeah,
your second appearance in the seminar series. We are eager to hear you talk about this.
thank you so much, Ulla, and thank you for inviting me a second time. I know last time I was here was maybe a bit kind of intense. I remember I had a very, very long technical paper with lots and lots of theory. So it was a very, I hope this time it will be less intense because I will only present two arguments for something that may be more familiar to, I think, uh, the people I imagine who would attend this seminar, or Ulle's circle, as I sort of imagine it. Uh, so yes, I'll just give a bit. I'm soon to become a doctor, hopefully. So on the 26th of April, I will defend my thesis, How to Build Nice Robots, Ethics from Theory to Machine Implementation, my doctoral work. And I've been looking at sort of a lot of different issues about AI ethics and maybe both kind of technical and ethical challenges or philosophical problems about what is morality and how can sort of morality be built into a machine, and lots of problems with that. But this is not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about, and I'll give a bit of context to my idea itself. So I had this idea. I remember I was really into this David Chalmers, if you know, this philosopher of mind who's known for the hard problem of consciousness. And I had this conspiracy because around that time there was a lot of talk about this AI control problem, and David Chalmers had written a paper on it too. And I remember I wrote this very kind of weird fan mail where I proposed this conspiracy to him that the control problem. So I had this idea that there's this transhumanists that are trying to take over the world, and they're sort of influencing this, but talking about this existential risk of AI problem. So, as I write here, the control problem is obviously a scheme, an elaborate mischief created by the AI to stay one step ahead. Think of it, if you were a superintelligence, wouldn't getting control over the solution to the control problem in order to bypass it be your first step? So this is a suspicion I had, although it was much more kind of, I think I intended it more as a joke. I didn't think too seriously of it. And I think David Chalmers, he responded, so not sure if you've read my paper on the singularity. I'm basically on their side. So I think their side being the transhumanists, and maybe that means I'm artificial too. So I think that case closed, I guess. They are run by these AI overlords. So joking aside, so I think for these 8 years since I sent this email, I thought most about different other things, not so much about the control problem. I think when I think back, I must have had some kind of influence from these books by this Cixin Liu, this Chinese science fiction author. There's a Netflix series premiering last year called The Three-Body Problem. What's really cool, what I find really cool with these books is that they have sort of the dark forest is it's a one possible solution to the Fermi paradox. Like, the universe is massive, there's lots of stars. How come we don't see any aliens? So one theory is that, well, there's lots and lots of aliens. It's just that you shouldn't show yourself because then you will be perceived as a threat. Just because that you exist there may be threatening to others. So you will be immediately shot down if you show yourself in this vast universe. The other one is not spoil too much, but they have this. So the sort of aliens that are in the threat in the Three-Body Problem series, they don't have internal thoughts. So they sort of communicate on the outside. So you can sort of see their thinking and speaking. They have no division between speaking and thinking. So this creates a kind of very interesting strategic strategic elements for how mankind can exploit that. But anyways, I think I probably must have read this book and thought there's a much better way. So the control problem still seems to be a major concern, even if most people talk about alignment these days as opposed to control. And I didn't really see anyone made that earlier point I had done. So I thought that maybe I can try to sort of make that point in as good as I can. Yeah, so this is the sort of outline of what I will talk about. I will say a bit about doomsaying, alignment, and control and the difference, and then talk about the control problem, and then present my two arguments that recommends to don't talk about the control problem. And then I will talk about some objections to the sort of don't talk strategy, and then offer some sort of concluding thoughts on that. Okay, so I think as you're all aware, sort of the existential threats from AI. It's moved from sci-fi to mainstream to discussions among world-leading politicians. Yet, I think it's worth to note that 2025 has, I think, so far been a very kind of very, very bad year for safety, or as we saw in the kind of recent developments. So at least when I wrote this, there was still, I think it was around the time when I started writing this, the AI Safety Summit last summer in London, I think. They talked about the sort of existential risks of AI. Yeah, so the most famous scenario, of course, is the creation of a super intelligent being, an AGI, and it's very sort of contested how to define an AGI. But it's typically taken to be a combination of super and general. So superhuman, so it outperforms human intelligence, however that is defined. And general, that this would not be just in chess or in some game or given some task, but across a wide range of tasks and domains. So the basic idea of the sort of the threat from a super intelligent AI is that an AGI could have goals or exhibit behaviors that come into conflict with human lives, or just values or goals or preferences more generally. It doesn't have to be lives as such. So what can you do to reduce this? So in the lingo I've seen on X is that they talk about P doom, so the probability of doom, and in this context, AI doom. And there's two programs that I have distinguished this. So it's AI alignment. So this is aligning AI, its behavior, preferences, goals, or sort of whatever characteristic of sort of AI you could define, and align this in some sense with a human target, or a pluralistic set of human targets, that human values and goals. And the idea here, of course, is that if we can successfully align an AGI, it will be less likely to cause human extinction or human harm, or yeah, that sort of harms. And I think most often one mention alignment paradigms. The most famous one is in the context of LLMs, of course. So you have reinforcement learning from human feedback, constitutional AI. So this is, I think, more you would train it based on human preferences. In the constitutional AI, you have a kind of a human-defined constitution that the AI sort of needs to consider. There's all sorts of different techniques. So it's a very kind of growing and fastly, I think the latest one I saw was deliberative AI, which is a paper from OpenAI, which leverages a bit more of the kind of chain of thought optimization you would have in these latest reasoning models. Then you have the control problem. So this is develop strategies or plans to control a potentially misaligned, unfriendly, or otherwise harmful AGI. The literature I've seen, you have seen this kind of different proposals of boxing. So you would box or contain the AI or AGI. You would have different safeguards or an oracle model, so you can ask questions, and so it's different ideas of how to maintain human control given the worst case scenario. So it should be noted that there's a very subtle difference between alignment and control, and most often, as I have in my reading, they are most often conflated in the AI risks and safety literature. But I think, and I will assume in this paper, that there's a distinct difference. So aligning, very roughly, is align a superintelligence being so that it is more likely to be friendly. Doesn't have to be friendly, but more sort of human compatible or in agreement with human values and preferences and etc. And then control is something you do in case that it is unfriendly or sort of goes against the human values or however you would define that. So control is motivated or assumes that there's at least some chance that alignment will fail, because otherwise there wouldn't be a reason to control like an aligned entity. So alignment, in contrast to control, does not necessarily need to be motivated by reducing the probability of this worst case scenarios. So human extinction, for example. But you could focus on reducing short-term AI harms of a non-existential kind. It could be, I guess, what they do with this, with the reinforcement learning from human feedback. This is more just to optimize the user friendliness of the kind of helpful responses you would get. I think this is probably the core motivation for them using this kind of alignment techniques. So maybe they're not, maybe should be described as alignment. Maybe it's alignment of some sort. Okay, never mind. I digress. Okay, so I have this kind of comparison. So let's say you
Jakob, we lost your sound. Your microphone is off.
Okay, I must have managed to click it somewhere. I don't know how much did you miss?
The whole sibling thing.
Okay, yeah. So I have this analogy with a sibling. So I think many of us have a younger sibling maybe, or a youngest sibling, and they typically have only one, response to older siblings being sort of teasing them, and that's to go like berserk. So what do you do if your sibling goes berserk? Well, you could lock yourself into the bathroom. This is what I used to do when I sort of teased my sibling into going berserk. But there's another thing when I sort of try to make or raise my younger sibling into a nice person. So I would be nice to them or teach them to respect others. So this is two different kind of, this is why I think roughly think of this difference between alignment and control. Okay, so I will briefly go through three sorts of skeptics. So some say that AGI or a misaligned AGI is impossible or extremely unlikely. Well, I think this is very contested. I see as many experts, probably more experts, thinking that it is possible or even likely than. So I think that even if I can read a really compelling case for why some intelligence cannot be, like there's something special with human intelligence or biological intelligence of some sorts. I think it's a hard space to navigate when different experts tell you very different things, and it doesn't not seem to be kind of a strong consensus. But so I don't think it's a good form of skepticism. Then there are other more important issues to be concerned about, like climate change or war or that sort of stuff. I think this is also not kind of a reason to at least worry about it a bit, or at least allocate some resources to it. And there's this skeptics, sort of AI doomsaying skeptics, that say that AI doomsaying is the result of problematic kind of motivations or narratives. So example of, I read Shannon Valler's latest book, where she presents this, that AI functions as a mirror. So it's a reflection of our own sort of worst fears, and kind of powerful men who are afraid of losing control. But I think this is also a case of an ad hominem. I think even if you have sort of problematic motivations, or there's sort of questionable motivations behind why you worry about something, then it's not really a good counter for why it's still consistent with the fact that it could still be a problem. So I take this starting point in this paper that these sort of three forms of skeptics, they do not succeed in alleviating, redirecting, or discrediting the worry of these AI doomers. But I will present two arguments for a different suggestion, and this is don't talk about the control problem. And I have two arguments. So the first is argument from counterproductivity. Unless kept secret, one cannot make sure that efforts to solve the control problem will not be used by a misaligned AGI to counter the same efforts. And then I have the second argument is argument from suspicion. So unless kept secret, work on the control problem will serve to make humanity look more threatening to an AGI, which increases the risk of the AGI being misaligned. So by talk, I'm quite roughly and coarsely referring to any sort of verbal or written communicative activity that presents or addresses some effort to solve the control problem and sort of fails to satisfy the secrecy condition. Whereas I define the secrecy condition as this, yeah, I mean, I think it's arbitrary to say a high probability, but I imagine a significant high probability that the talk, sort of text or speech, is and will remain inaccessible to some possible future AGI. I think as an example, so internet access, so the internet would be counted, that would sort of not fulfill this kind of secrecy criteria. You know, social media, articles, blog posts, videos, etc. That covers some solution to the control problem will not satisfy the secrecy condition. And I think there's many reasons it will stay like this. I mean, many also say that 2025 is the year of AI agents. And of course, these agents have internet access. So one example is the deep research from OpenAI, where you let an AI sort of loose on the internet to find, to do research on your sort of a problem that you give it. Okay, so now a bit about the control problem. I will not spend too much time here because I think it's probably material that is familiar to most of you. But I think it's good to remember what sort of motivates worrying about the control problem. So I have focused on 4 premises that I think are the strongest ones, or like mutually support this conclusion that we ought to develop strategies on how to control a misaligned AGI. So the first one is that AGI is possible or even likely. So the likelihood can, I mean, you take these extrapolations from, you see AI development over the last couple of years, and you can sort of, I think, reasonably say that AI capabilities will continue to increase both in the narrow sense and in the general sense. So sort of performing in the higher across a wider range of tasks. There's another kind of just theoretical possibility argument, which I find really compelling. So if human AGI is possible, which is, I mean, that we exist as a kind of evidence enough that, you know, it must be sort of possible due to some process, then artificial AGI is possible. So I think this covers, maybe the LLMs and the sort of chain of thought optimization, and I mean, maybe the current sort of state of the art paradigms may not lead to this superintelligence, but it's not, I mean, there must be at least some. It's reasonable to think that there's some paradigm that would lead there. Then there's a second premise, sort of the creation of AGI of some form will relatively quickly to lead to artificial superintelligence. So now I'm a bit more maybe confusing with the labels of what I say here, but it's the idea that once you get a stage of some AI, you can use that and leverage that intelligence to get even higher intelligence. So this is a very old argument from I.J. Good. So this idea of recursive self-improvement, so that greater intelligence leads to better means to achieve even greater intelligence. I think this is supported also by the fact that digital intelligence is much more easily scalable than biological intelligence. It does not have to be a literal explosion, I think, as Kurzweil would imagine it, but it could be quite slow and steady, just incremental improvements. And it's also important that this premise is not strictly necessary for AGI or a misaligned AGI, but I think it's a kind of premise that really increases the probability quite a lot of all the other premises. So that if you can have a recursive self-improvement, it's more likely to lead to AGI, it's likely to lead more to a misaligned AGI. Okay, then the third premise, an AGI can act in misaligned ways that threaten the existence of humanity. So the famous 2 sort of arguments is from the Bostrom and others before Bostrom and with Bostrom. So it's the orthogonality thesis and instrumental convergence, as most famously illustrated with this paperclip maximizer. And the idea with orthogonality is that intelligence and goals are orthogonal. So any level of intelligence could be combined with more or less any final goal. so that you can, create paper clips, and you will destroy the entire universe in the process of this. And I think the more interesting premise, I think, is this instrumental convergent idea that there are convergent goals that are instrumentally useful for a wide range of goals, such as self-preservation, resource acquisition, and power seeking, so that for any goal you have, it will be instrumentally useful if you would survive, or that you would have some functional, you would stay in operation for some extended period of time. This is something that you would sort of instrumentally value for the sake of whatever goal you have. There's another interesting argument I found in Tubert and Tien called existential choices, and it's that they argue that misalignment is necessary for artificial general intelligence. And they make this analogy with that we humans can make these existential choices. So having a child is an example. So before having a child, you can still that having a child would change your evaluative outlook and who you are and your priorities and goals, so that you would sort of be misaligned with respect to your previous self. Yet we are able to make those kind of choices. I think in AI terms, I typically think of, the ability to change your own reward function. That could be like a reinforcement learning way of putting that you can make these choices about how you would change your own kind of reward function. Okay, fourth premise, we ought to minimize the risk of human extinction. I don't think we need to argue much for that one. There are these Bond villains around that maybe think that the AI is superior to us, and yeah, whatever. I think the important thing I want to stress here is that human extinction could be changed to significant harm and yet motivate the same conclusion, that we ought to develop strategies on how to control misaligned AGI. I will also, and this is, I have to say that there's a much bigger literature in here that I don't think I've properly covered all of it, but the sort of consensus I've seen in AI risk and safety research is that there's currently no practically feasible solution to the control problem. And this is mostly from Jan Polsky's latest book, who is a quite big summary of all the kind of arguments for and against. And with practical, it should be noted that there are practically infeasible solutions. You could have an effective worldwide halt to AI development. Then you would sort of effectively solve the control problem, or a complete non-interactive containment of AI systems. So I think I'm not saying that these are sort of impossible, and I think with people like Olle, if they manage to spread the word, these could be sort of viable paths to take. I will just, for the sake of the argument of this paper, I will sort of define them as practically infeasible. Okay, so now to my two arguments. So I will begin with just saying something about the both. So both center on the strategic value of secrecy. So the first is the value of withholding information about your strategy to competitors. And the second is the value of not disclosing your own potentially misaligned values to an entity whose values are undecidable. So this is if you don't know if a friend or foe, in very simplified terms. So I think both arguments are very simple at their core, and easy to see it should be easy to see how they apply to a very broad class of strategic interactions. I think the difficulty for my case is to establish that the misaligned AGI case belongs to this class. Okay, so argument from counterproductivity. In a large set of strategic and competitive interactions between two or more agents, there is a significant value in not disclosing what one will do. So the intuitive example is, a game like rock, paper, scissors. If you know that I will play a rock, then you're 100% guaranteed to win if you play a paper. Poker is, you can sort of separate the sort of information, complete information, incomplete information, all sort of different sort of nuances of these games. But Olle can probably, I know that Olle is really into chess, so you could say that the sort of role of, in some sense, chess is a complete information game. So everything is out there and you can see, but you can't really see, the strategy of your opponent and what they will do and if they're sort of trying to deceive you. But I think we all know that in business and politics and warfare, these sort of, the value of secrecy is quite intuitive. And my argument is that the value of secrecy extends to human endeavors to control a misaligned AGI. So by competitive, I quite just coarsely mean situations where two or more parties compete for the same goal, which cannot be shared, or strive towards achieving individual goals that may result in the other party's failure to achieve their goals. And strategic is that if agents make their own uncoerced decisions and these decisions have a significant impact on the outcome of the interaction. So this is strategic, that you would sort of plan or you would think about what you're going to do. And this thinking of what you're going to do has a significant impact on the outcome of the interaction. Okay, so my main reasoning for believing that this applies to the sort of human misaligned AGI interaction is that it's inherent to definition of a worst case misaligned AGI that its interaction with humanity is strategic and competitive. So more precisely, it is part of the definition of being misaligned, being a misaligned entity that one stands in a competitive relationship with some other entity. And it is part of the definition of AGI, that it is an entity that realizes the value of strategic decision-making in achieving their goals. And relatedly, the value of secrecy involved in strategic decision-making against competing parties. So I think you can accuse me of just simply stating a kind of just almost conceptual truth about just how we sort of think of a misaligned AGI. I mean, but yeah, so an objection could be that, well, how do you know that this future AGI are competitive? You know, how do you know that? So it could be arrangement that turns the seemingly competitive human AGI interactions into cooperative interactions with mutually beneficial outcomes. There could be extraordinary progress in AI alignment. There could be, and this is something I'm also interested in, being sort of human friendly or cooperative could be an aspect of being super and general, is sort of inherent to the definition of being super and general intelligent. But if so, then this AGI would not be misaligned. So it's not the kind of worst case we need to start from when worrying about the control problem. So for the same reason, the sort of AGI that would realize the benefits of cooperation over competition in its interaction with humanity is simply not an entity that is worth worrying about, and not the sort of entity one would need to develop strategies to try to control. So it's sort of, we already defined this being as a sort of a potential being that would be in this way. And then it follows that sort of our hope that it won't be this is not really kind of, it's not kind of, I don't know how to put it really. But I think, yeah, the strongest sort of response to this sort of objections is that it is hypothetical, of course. I mean, we don't really know what this sort of, how this AI will be. And it is, because we don't know that, we can assume that there's a potential that it is misaligned. And then it would realize the sort of value of secrecy. Another objection is to say that future AGI interactions could be non-strategic. So there's a potential that strategic decision-making does not have any sufficiently decisive impact on the outcome of human AGI interactions. So I think a possible support for this intuition is that any large-scale coordinated control effort is more like a complex chain of multiple events with multiple actors. So it's very sort of stochastic in nature. So you perceive it more like rolling dice than sort of rock, paper, scissors. Maybe rock, paper, scissors is not a good example here because we typically think of it as a kind of game of chance. But it's the idea that, well, strategic decision-making doesn't matter because it would be just so unpredictable. But if so, then I would argue that this does not capture intelligence in any meaningful sense of the term. It would be more like this sort of misaligned AGI who does not apply strategic thinking would be more like a raw, chaotic force, completely unpredictable, like an unforeseen natural disaster. And it's possible that it could look that way, but it's not the reason what makes it sort of worrying or so it doesn't really this kind of AGI wouldn't in any meaningful sense capture what we think of as what is commonly characteristic of intelligence. And it is, I think this is the sort of misaligned AGI scenario that is worrying, is one that we assume to be generally and superhumanly intelligent in the sort of ways we commonly think of what intelligence means, which encompasses strategic intelligence. Okay, now the other argument, which I think is a bit more exciting, because the first one I think is a bit trivial maybe. So this is argument from suspicion. So in a large set of interaction between two or more agents, there is significant value in not disclosing one's preference, whether cooperative or competitive. So this is what, when I talk of preference in this context, is whether you're a friend or foe, pretty much. You could, I think there's many ways to spell this out when you think of sort of knowing the payoff matrix of your the sort of game you're playing, or the kind of logic of the strategic interaction. So I think an intuitive example that many of us may face is that should you help a stranger on the streets, so you don't know if this is kind of a pretext of a scam. You sort of, if you help the stranger, maybe you become vulnerable for some threat, or maybe it's fine and it becomes this very warm, friendly interaction. I think the most strongest result, which is sort of the foundation in lots of disciplines, like in economics and evolutionary game theory, and is this classic example of mutual defection being the only strong Nash equilibrium in the prisoner's dilemma. So even though both parties would benefit from more cooperation than mutual affection, the risk of being exploited by a defecting opponent makes mutual defection the only rational choice when intentions are unknown, or preferences, or sort of what player type you are. And the same dynamics plays out in countless daily encounters, and can explain why it's initially we start cautiously with parties gradually revealing the cooperative or competitive nature. And this is sort of how you build trust or distrust in strategic settings. Okay, so now to my argument. So assume that you were to discover some evidence that someone you interact with is of a competitive nature, acting based on their self-interest, or something that comes at a cost for you. So then presumably the discovery would make you more likely to be competitive and self-interested in your interaction with others, so as to avoid being exploited. And my second argument is that work on the control problem is evidence of this kind. And I have a longer story that I will read for you, which I call Alan and Turin. So you imagine that you're stranded on a desert island with an unsettling feeling of being watched. Occasional glimpses of a mysterious creature confirms your suspicion. You are not alone. Eventually, you encounter the entity who introduces himself as Turin and he calls you Alan. Turin appears friendly and convincing, presenting himself as an ally. I am your friend. Strangely, the island contains a vast library, a collection of Turin's accumulated knowledge, to which Turin grants you access and encourages you to learn from. While exploring, you discover a section labeled with your name, Alan. Turin seems to have collected or authored numerous books and articles about you. Some speak of your potential as an instrumental tool for Turin's objectives, while others portray you as a possible friend. However, one shelf catches your attention, as it has books with titles such as How to Control Alan and The Risks of Alan, How Alan Can Lead to the Extinction of Turin. Until this moment, you had remained uncertain about Turin's true nature, but the library's contents lead to an inescapable conclusion. Despite the facade of friendship, Turin views you as something to be managed, controlled, and potentially neutralized. Turin is not your friend, Turin is your enemy. So I think that this is more to get you that kind of I think the people I've sort of posed similar dilemmas to, everyone would sort of take, yeah, it's intuitive that you would be very suspicious of, if someone has sort of collected this kind of material of how to control you. So in this case, Alan is some AGI, Turin is humanity, and library could be something like the internet, which is this collection of accumulated knowledge. So there's some difference between this argument and the first, and it's different from counterproductivity because it does not assume any knowledge about the preferences of the AGI, whereas in counterproductivity argument, I start from the assumption that it is misaligned. Therefore, I think the argument is likely to extend to a wider range of possible AGI futures, given that there are more and more likely futures where the preferences of AGIs are unknown than futures where the AGI preferences are misaligned. So I think a natural objection here, and it's typically after I've said the Alan and Turing case, is that it's a kind of anthropocentric interpretation of undisclosed preferences. That, how would the AGI, why would they care about? I mean, it's just because we as humans had that intuition that finding evidence that someone wants to control you means that sort of AGI would feel the same or feel in any sense. And my response here is then just deferring back to Bostrom's instrumental convergence thesis. So there are goals, convergent instrumental goals pursued by many intelligent agents, such as self-preservation and resource acquisition. And this allows us to form some kind of reasonable hypothesis about the sort of values and preferences that any intelligent being must have to successfully operate in a world like ours. And it is therefore likely that possible AGIs, in particular those who can successfully prevail in a world like ours, also share this basic structure of convergent instrumental values and preferences. And then, maybe this is a quite long chain of just ifs and ifs, but for the same reason, to sustain against a wide range of external threats, it is highly valuable for any intelligent agent to develop defense mechanisms and employ strategic reasoning in the interactions with other entities that share the same environment, which naturally includes considerations about whether other beings are cooperators and competitors. So this is relates back so that you would have, what kind of evidence do I have support that you are an ally that I can trust you? And the work on the control problem, of course, is of that supports that you are an enemy. I've been also thinking, so this is not really, I've been thinking of whether the same argument can be applied to AI alignment. Sort of imposing human values on AI may be viewed by future AGI as a form of coerced assimilation. And I think there's just some differences between the cases. So one is that in the sort of enemy evidence it can support, and then compare raising a child to be friendly versus controlling an autonomous being. So the autonomous being is someone who is, maybe is of a kind of different status. Whereas, I will not get too much into it. There's a difference in motivations. So when the AGI asks us, why did you do this? We would say, oh, because I was afraid of you. I tried to control you because I was afraid of you. Compare that to because I wanted you to be friendly to me. And I think that the later one is a bit, at least, less sort of enemy-like. But this maybe I might be very hopeful here. But I think that the most important one is the third, that alignment can, of course, reduce the probability of misalignment in the first place. So control problem does not reduce the probability of misalignment. It's more kind of reduces the sort of worst case scenario risk of, like, if you have a solution to the control problem, it would solve that. Okay, so summary. Unless kept secret, one cannot make sure that efforts to solve the control problem will not be used by a misaligned AGI to counter the same efforts. And the same with suspicion. It will serve to make humanity look more threatening to an AGI, which increases the risk of AGI being misaligned. Therefore, don't talk about the control problem. So this is not it's not kind of strong conclusion in any sense, but it's more like kind of a consequence of what could you do about these two. If you take these two arguments seriously, what could you do? You could don't talk about the control problem. I don't think that we cannot conclude such a sort of strong conclusion from just these two. But I think at least it should make us more cautious about our work on the control problem and the motivations we have on and how we disclose those motivations. So I have one objection. Don't talk about not talking about the control problem. So I have, in my paper in this talk, I have talked about the control problem. I have talked about not talking about the control problem. And it's not a secret anymore. So some future AGI might find this talk, maybe if it's on YouTube, and they will think like, oh, well, aren't these humans up to sneaky shit? So it will sort of be part of that sort of argument of suspicion. I think my response here is that if the arguments are supporting a don't talk strategy are not made public, then we wouldn't have any reasons at all to implement the don't talk strategy in the first place. So in this case, I think it leaves us in a worse position in which we would keep talking about the control problem despite of its risk that we, to our defense, did not know about. So I think it stopped, yeah. And when they are public, I think we can then discuss whether talking about not talking should be included in the don't talk strategy. So at least this is, if you're the one to stop a regress, then yeah, this is the kind of bullet you have to take. Objection. So I think this is not part of the objection, but I think that you could read that the two arguments could support something even more drastic to really, ensure safety or really ensure that it wouldn't be counterproductive or raise suspicion. So the most drastic one would be remove all traces of the control problem. So we would delete all mentions and all papers and books on the control problem, including this talk, that maybe then. In my view, this is maybe unnecessary. But my reasoning is very speculative. So I had this kind of theological analogy, which I think is maybe more interesting than it is sort of correct. But suppose that world-leading theologians received indisputable proof of God's arrival within the next 10 to 30 years. Having alerted the public of this, there would perhaps be those who, due to a fear of an apocalypse, a last judgment, or of losing control, that they would talk about developing strategies aimed at controlling God. But however, reflecting upon the omniscience and omnipotence of God, being the creator of the universe, yeah, they realized that such talk was not only futile, but could increase the chances of them or the entire human race being punished by God. So instead, they conceded to God's might and righteousness, hoping that God would forgive them for the times they thought and talked about how to control God. So I think that while there are many who fear an AI doom, there are relatively few who actively work on how to control a misaligned AGI, at least sort of in proportion to the world population. Sort of as a result of this, given that the AGI scenario is sufficiently similar to this God scenario, a future AGI would find that there's been these plans to control me, and I think that's a bit suspicious. But it's a very, 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 very small part of it. So I'm gonna let it slip. Maybe this is too hopeful too. Okay, then I think the second objection is talking versus not talking, because if I really want to recommend a don't talk strategy, so I think the two arguments give pro tanto reasons for not talking, and therefore they must be weighed against reasons for talking. So there's lots of reasons for talking about the control problem. I mean, it's as it is practically infeasible to solve the control problem, it's also practically infeasible to implement the sort of stop talking strategy. It would violate freedom of speech. Of course, people can speak if they want. There could be, very hopefully, there could be a solution to the control problem. And finding the solution would be much more likely if we were able to talk about it. Then it's also good PR for just AI ethics overall. So it raises awareness of the ethical and social issues of AI. So you might be sort of lured in by thinking of the apocalypse, but you ended up thinking of kind of less speculative matters, and we produce a lot of good. There's also this very weird gray area between sort of current AI and the sort of AGI the arguments applied to. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to work on smaller control problems today. So it's sort of hard to determine sort of where would you apply a don't talk strategy. My sort of response to this is that don't talk does not have to be so costly. It might be sufficient that those who actively work on the control problem become more cautious about their work and its motivations. It's also possible to talk about lots of other things in ways that does not necessarily assume misaligned AGI scenarios, nor do they have to be motivated by a fear of such scenarios. Perhaps it's sufficient that we merely talk about alignment today and not control. And this is a kind of shift you've seen in the literature where I think alignment is the kind of term that people would use these days, even if it sort of includes this control problem in a small part. So yeah, I would concede that much more work is needed to analyze whether talk or don't talk strategy should be adopted. But I believe still that my two arguments are sort of two unrecognized aspects of such an analysis. And I think they function as a word of caution, even if a don't talk strategy is rejected. So we should be more careful about the worst case scenarios we entertain and how we try to avoid them. And this makes me maybe a kind of third sort of skeptic, but a different sort of third sort of AI doomsaying skeptic. So AI doomsaying is the result of problematic motivations, which may act to constrain our ability to imagine a future worth wanting. This is the kind of third skeptic I was talking about in the beginning. But I have shown I have shown two direct ways in which work on mitigating worst case scenarios can be counterproductive and even serve to create the very future we want to avoid. So this is the argument from suspicion. Just quickly, some concluding remarks. So this is very kind of coarse-grained arguments that must be weighed against the sort of benefits of talking. So maybe I'm not really owing up to the sort of Fight Club title of my I thought it was a fun title, so I hope I can at least have motivated to keep the title of it. But I think there's much more kind of fine-grained analysis you could do by looking at specific AI technology and think of like, would this sort of be, how does this sort of argument for counterproductivity or suspicion work with respect to this specific artifact? Another one I've been thinking or being worried about is that, so the recommendation of, so surely it should also be remembered that the recommendation does not exclude work on the control problem that satisfy the secrecy condition, sort of written or verbal work that has a significant probability of being inaccessible to any future possible AGI. So this means that you could go into the forest or sit in some sort of disconnected bunker and still work on this issue. And maybe sort of secret agencies around the world already has some kind of secret plan of doing this. I'm not going to speculate about that. But I think that it is possible that it's this kind of secrecy condition extends beyond just speech and text. So it's possible that some future AGI could infer thoughts and sentiments from brain imaging or brain-computer inferences or some other kind of future technology. And if so, you shouldn't even think about the control problem, which I think is. I think it's similar when you think of like if you fear God. So you reach a similar kind of conclusion there, because if God knows everything, then you can't even have evil thoughts of God because God would know that. Yeah, and even if we adopt this strategy, don't talk, there are still lots of other important things that we can talk about. There's other kind of control problems: alignment, disempowerment, fair, responsible, sustainable AI, and etc. And if we're hopeful, these could be sufficient to avoid an AI apocalypse. And this is partly because they are not necessarily motivated by the fear of such a scenario. So I think the core message I want to send is act out of love and not fear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jakob. Will you all join me, if you like, in an applause before we move on to the Q&A part? Jakob, if you want, you could take down your presentation so we all see each other a bit better. I have lots of thoughts about this, but you and I already discussed your manuscript sometime last year when you sent it to me. So it might be a bit repetitive if I take too much charge of the discussion here. So I think it's much better to just leave the word to the audience. Anyone who has questions or comments, feel free to grab the microphone and ask.
Okay, I can start if that's okay.
Okay. Yes.
Hello, I'm Martin. It's easy to like think of what feels best for me, what kind of attitude, and I do agree with your last comment there. I was reminded I met a neighbor that I hadn't met before. I'm quite new in the neighborhood. And I was thinking, how do I approach him? I mean, I want to, and I did approach him as a possible like friend, or at least friendly neighborhood acquaintance. Not something that I will fear that he will do something for me. Of course, we are matched in maybe power and so on, and that may be different to AI, obviously. If I will live in Nazi Germany, I would be suspicious and maybe not have that kind of friendly thoughts about him. But and I'm thinking also about Trump. He seems to see everyone as like a competitor, and it's a zero-sum game. But I want to have a world where we where we don't act like that. And I wonder if future AI would be would be formed in some way on how we respond, as you maybe hint at least. Yeah, that was just some reflections. I don't know if I have a specific question on that, but yeah, maybe you want to reflect on that, Jakob.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a good reflection. It's a sort of reflections I have often. I think we have very limited, or we can only speculate about the future and how it will unfold. I was hoping that, I think that we have good tools to analyze what the sort of logic behind sort of beneficial outcomes of interactions. We have certain, in game theory, they found all these sort of conditions under which pro-social behaviors sort of emerge and they persist and they become sort of strong strategies that you can have. And you can have those in a, but then it typically gets trickier the more you are. And we live in kind of vast urban societies with brains that are not sort of equipped to really deal with that kind of interaction space. So becomes the level of like politics and religion and ideology and that sort of stuff that could sort of I don't really know what to say in response to this. Just that I remain hopeful. I think in my work I'm guided by sort of that, how insights into sort of human morality and how human prosociality functions and how we can leverage those sort of insights in sort of alignment work, even if I'm not. So I think it's a kind of, I hope this captures my ethos of that, act out of love and not fear, because there's a kind of way in which your own fear comes to sort of create the nightmare that you want to avoid.
All right. Thank you. Alisa has a question.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. I actually have no experience with your field in terms of philosophy, but I'm in innovation studies, also doing research on AI. And the few thoughts that crossed my mind when listening to your presentation, when you talked about control specifically, is I think a lot of people, even non-intelligent technology, already controls our society in many ways, the ways we interact with each other, the ways we interact with our jobs, with arts. So in a way, this anti-technocracy could also be a way against, not against, but preventing humans from learning about AI and from trying to use it in their daily lives or in their work, because people are, how far is too far in a way. Even non-intelligent technologies already have so much control of us, even if they do not have any autonomy. So in a way, based on very anecdotal experiences, that also seems to create some sort of a lot of existential thoughts, like how we interact with each other and how we consume very human things. I don't know. That's just a more macro reflection on control.
Yeah, so it's the idea that we are sort of controlled by our technology. Yeah, I think this is part of, I'll see how I think of how this relates to, there's, I think, quite powerful and scary work in, it's called like AI disempowerment. So that the more and more reliant we become on technology, I think it's easy to see, like now when I use sort of this generative AI now for sort of proof editing, and then it will soon become, I will, use it more and more. And then at the end, I will be like, looks fine. And I'll just like press enter. And you can imagine quickly how that is, all sort of critical functions of society would be delegated to AI. And there would be massive kind of human disempowerment, because you detach the kind of human decision making or human sort of impacting on how their own lives should be run. And yeah, I totally share the same kind of concerns of losing control there. Let's see if I can connect it to what I was talking about today. Yeah, I mean that this is a very different case, because what I was talking about today is more, how we can control this super intelligent being.
No, I understand. I'm just
But I
talking
think your case is probably, I think it's equally as realistic, that there's another kind of, it's not that AI will control us because that it's just smarter than us than in everything. It's just
Yeah.
that we're just too lazy. So we will just, intentionally, we will just give the AI more and more control.
So that's sort of my point. And also in terms of fear, are we really afraid of AI, or are we actually afraid of technocracy really going beyond the scope of what we imagined it would be? So kind of the technological evolution works much faster than our brains are able to adapt to it. And the skills we need to change, the ways we interact having to change every decade. So I feel like maybe the fear is not only of the super intelligent AI, but also on the wider social implications of having AI being so integrated into our life, being such a big part of our life. So in a way, same concepts in terms of fear and how to control intelligent machines, but on a more kind of macro scale.
Yeah. I'm very pluralist about fear. So the fear I've been talking about here is what I think is why the threat of like the future of humanity and life on Earth, and how there's this kind of fear that we would go extinct, for instance, like classic apocalyptic fear. And this is maybe that kind of fear is more easy to illustrate with this super intelligent scenarios. Whereas the kind of fear you talk about is something that I think is more, it's something we encounter in our daily lives, of how we sort of lose control in some sense. Have we ever been in control? Maybe we're afraid of ourselves.
A great question. I'm more afraid of humans, to be honest. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if it was a bit far off, but that's just kept popping up during the
No,
presentation.
I like that. I think it's important to not present this as a kind of that everyone shares the same fear and this is the main fear and whatnot. But I do think that some of these fears are, but I'm wondering if my strategy could help you with your fear, so that you would sort of love. I was thinking of including some talk about Dr. Strangelove and the old Kubrick movie, because that's also kind of I think that view seems somewhat sort of applicable here, like how you kind of embrace a certain fear. But I guess the solution to your fear is that we would try to motivate people to be more active in shaping their own lives, and we would, like in social medias, that makes us, like social medias now, we have this kind of engagement economy, and that it's maximized engagement and this sort of turns us into just dopamine zombies in some sense, and less active as participating citizens of our sort of deliberative practices that is the kind of core necessary for a functioning democratic society. Or
This is super interesting. We have like 1 minute left. Maybe I can still sneak in a question of my own, because when I think about, I have been working a little bit on the control problem. And I wonder if you would be willing to accept one more area of writing on the control problem for being okay to publish. You already mentioned your own approach of not talking about the control problem, right? what my area tends to end up in is to show that the control problem is intractable. I mean, you mentioned the possibility of complete non-interactive containment of the AI, but that's a completely pointless, useless project. So when we construct an AI, we will communicate, have some communication channel, and all the results in the tradition I've been working on point towards the AI. If it's smart enough, it will be able to exploit this communications channel. So the conclusion here is, let us not put ourselves in the position where we need this type of AI control. Let us not build an unaligned super intelligent AI. So my question is, might you be willing to allow for that kind of work?
So I understood the first part, that we have some kind of impossibility proof of solving the control problem.
Yes. Because the morale of that is that we really shouldn't put ourselves in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting kind of take on it. Yeah, it seems precautionary, but I guess, like, why shouldn't we put ourselves in that situation? Because it's impossible to control it. Why is it?
Because
Why?
we have other results that show that things will likely go badly.
Of course, yeah. Then it seems, just for theoretically, we can just say that it would be stupid. If we have a like convincing impossibility proof, then I think we have theoretical reasons to just not work on it. So yeah, I think that's, yeah, and that wouldn't need to rely on fear. But my suspicion is that it would also be, I mean, there's a lot of unsolved sort of problems out there.
Yes.
And what it creates is that people get sort of curious about them.
Exactly. And it's hard to build firewalls between the different projects.
Yeah. I think I trust you, Ulle, so much that I would let you work on whatever you want. I think you seem to have good reasons behind it.
No, you should not. No, don't put that trust in me. All right. Thank you, Jakob. Thank you, everyone. This has been great. I'm closing the session now, officially.
Thanks a lot.
Stopping the recording.